Karoline Leavitt walked into the Secret Service headquarters, her congressional badge gleaming. But the receptionist's sneer said she didn't belong. "This isn't the intern desk." "Sweetheart," she snapped, as agents smirked. Karoline stayed calm, her hand on a notebook that held her father's secrets. She wasn't just a young congresswoman. She was the daughter of a man they'd betrayed. So why did they think they could dismiss her? Before we dive into today's story, if you find this video interesting, don't forget to hit the like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any upcoming stories. You're also welcome to leave a comment and share your thoughts. Every piece of feedback is truly valuable in helping Crossfire Justice improve. Thank you so much for always being with us. And now, let's jump into this thrilling and unexpected story together. The lobby of the Secret Service headquarters in Alexandria, Virginia, was a cathedral of order, marble floors polished to a mirror shine, walls lined with framed commendations, and a faint hum of authority in the air. Karoline Leavitt stepped inside, her low heels clicking softly, each step measured, deliberate. At 32, she was one of the youngest members of Congress, her dark blazer and neatly pinned badge marking her as someone with purpose. She was here for a routine security audit, a task assigned to her oversight committee. But the weight in her chest told her this wasn't just another day. Her fingers brushed the edge of a worn leather notebook tucked in her pocket, a keepsake from her father, a man whose name once echoed in these very halls. The receptionist, a woman in her late 50s with a tight bun and a nameplate reading Margaret, sat behind a sleek counter. She didn't look up as Karoline approached, her eyes fixed on a computer screen, fingers tapping with practiced indifference. "Excuse me," Karoline said, her voice calm but firm. "I'm here for the audit. Congresswoman Leavitt." Margaret's gaze flicked upward, slow and deliberate, like she was sizing up a stray dog. "You must be lost, sweetheart," she said, her tone sharp enough to cut. "This isn't the intern desk." Karoline's jaw tightened, a flicker of heat rising in her cheeks. She'd heard comments like this before, too young, too female, too new to be taken seriously. But today, in this place, it stung deeper. Her father had walked these halls, his badge a symbol of sacrifice. She forced a polite smile, her voice steady. "I'm not lost. I'm scheduled with Agent Richard at 10. Margaret leaned back, her lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Newbies always think they're important," she muttered, loud enough for the two agents lingering near the coffee machine to hear. They exchanged smirks, their eyes darting to Karoline, then away. She stood there, the weight of their judgment pressing against her. But she didn't flinch. Her hand slipped into her pocket, fingers tracing the notebook's cracked leather. It was her anchor, a reminder of why she'd come, not just for the audit, but for something she couldn't yet name. She handed Margaret her ID, her gaze steady, though her pulse quickened. The receptionist took it with a huff, scanning it with exaggerated slowness. "Wait over there," Margaret said, pointing to a row of stiff chairs by the wall. As Karoline turned, her eyes caught a shadow moving down the hallway, a tall man in a dark suit, his gait familiar, hauntingly so. Her breath hitched. It couldn't be him. Daniel, her father's partner, had died 5 years ago, or so she'd been told. The man glanced back, his face half hidden. But his eyes locked with hers for a split second before he disappeared around a corner. Her heart pounded, questions swirling. Why was he here? What was he hiding? Margaret's voice cut through her thoughts, sharp and impatient. "Your ID checks out." "Barely." She slid the card back across the counter like it was an inconvenience. Karoline took it, her fingers trembling slightly, not from fear but from the sudden certainty that this place held secrets tied to her father, to Daniel, to her. She walked to the chairs, her steps slower now, every sense alert. The lobby felt colder, the agent's whispers louder. Something was about to unravel, and she was standing at the edge of it. Karoline Leavitt sat in a hard plastic chair in a quiet corner of the Secret Service headquarters lobby in Alexandria, Virginia. The kind of chair that seemed designed to make you feel small. The air was heavy with the scent of industrial cleaner, and the low hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Her fingers curled around a worn leather notebook, its edges frayed from years of being carried, touched, remembered. It was her father's, a relic from a man who'd once been a legend in these halls. A Secret Service agent whose name, Michael Leavitt, had carried weight until the day he died, or so they'd told her. The notebook was filled with his cryptic shorthand, a code she'd spent years deciphering, though she still hadn't unlocked all its secrets. Today it felt like both a shield and a burden, anchoring her to a purpose she couldn't yet fully name. Margaret's words from earlier echoed in her mind, sharp and dismissive. "This isn't the intern desk, sweetheart." The sting wasn't new. Karoline had faced plenty of raised eyebrows in Congress, where her youth and quiet demeanor made her an easy target for those who mistook softness for weakness. But here, in this building where her father's legacy lingered, the condescension cut deeper. She kept her face composed, her dark eyes steady, though her chest tightened with a familiar ache. She wasn't just a congresswoman on an audit. She was a daughter, chasing answers to questions that had haunted her for 5 years. Why had her father's death been so sudden, so shrouded in vague reports? Why had no one ever explained the mission that took him across the lobby? Margaret stood behind her counter, her voice low but deliberate as she spoke to a colleague, bedsheets and pillowcases. "That young congresswoman thinks she's important," Margaret muttered, loud enough for Karoline to hear. "Probably got her job through connections." The colleague smirked, glancing at Karoline before turning away. Karoline's fingers tightened on the notebook, her knuckles pale. She wanted to stand, to say something, but she didn't. Not yet. She'd learned long ago that words thrown in anger rarely landed where you wanted. Instead, she traced the notebook's spine, her mind drifting to her father's last words to her. "Truth doesn't need a megaphone, Caro. It just needs time." A junior agent, Tom, walked past, his steps slowing as he caught Margaret's gossip. He was young, maybe a few years older than Karoline, with a cautious demeanor that suggested he hadn't yet earned his place here. His eyes met Karoline's for a moment, his expression unreadable curiosity. Maybe, or pity. She couldn't tell. He hesitated, as if he might say something, then kept walking, disappearing down a hallway. Karoline watched him go, her thoughts churning. She didn't need his sympathy, and she needed answers. The notebook in her hands wasn't just a keepsake, it was a map, a puzzle her father had left behind. She'd found fragments of it already, dates, initials, a cryptic reference to something called Blackthorn. She didn't know what it meant, but she knew it was tied to this place, to the secrets buried in these walls. Her reverie broke as Margaret's voice cut through the lobby, clipped and insincere. "Congresswoman Leavitt, they're ready for you." The receptionist's smile was all teeth, her eyes cold. Karoline stood, smoothing her blazer, the notebook tucked securely in her pocket. She felt the weight of eyes on her Margaret's, the colleagues, maybe others she couldn't see. They thought they knew her, thought they had her figured out, a young woman out of her depth, playing at power. They were wrong. She wasn't here to prove herself to them. She was here for her father, for the truth he died for. As she walked toward the audit room, her steps steady, she felt a shift inside her like a door creaking open. The answers were close. She could feel it, but as she reached the door, she caught another glimpse of that silhouette down the hall, the man she'd seen earlier, the one who looked like Daniel, her father's old partner. He was supposed to be dead, killed in the same mission that took her father. Yet there he was, alive, moving with purpose. Her pulse quickened, a mix of fear and certainty. If Daniel was here, then everything she'd been told about her father's death was a lie. She paused, her hand on the door, the notebook heavy in her pocket. Whatever was waiting on the other side, she was ready to face it. Or so she hoped. The audit room in the Secret Service headquarters in Alexandria, Virginia, felt like a vault, cold, sterile, and deliberately intimidating. Its gray walls were lined with sleek monitors, their screens dark except for the occasional flicker of security feeds. Karoline Leavitt sat at a long metal table, her congressional badge glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights, her posture straight despite the weight of the moment. Across from her sat Richard, the lead agent, a man in his late 40s with a square jaw and eyes that seemed to measure her worth in a single glance. 3 other agents flanked him, their faces unreadable but their body language loud, arms crossed, chairs tilted back, a silent chorus of skepticism. Karoline's notebook rested in her lap, hidden beneath the table, its leather warm against her fingers. It was her father's, a tether to the man who'd taught her to stand firm. Even when the room felt like it was closing in, she opened her mouth to begin, her voice calm but clear. "I'd like to start with the protocols for classified mission logs," she said, flipping open a folder of prepared questions. Before she could finish, Richard cut her off, his voice smooth but sharp, like a blade wrapped in silk. "With all due respect, Congresswoman, we don't need oversight from someone barely out of college." The words landed like a slap, and the other agents chuckled, their laughter low and mean, emboldened by their leader's disdain. Karoline's pulse quickened, a hot flush creeping up her neck, but she didn't flinch. She'd faced rooms like this before: committee hearings, town halls, campaign trails where men like Richard assumed her youth meant she was out of her depth. But this wasn't just politics. This was personal. She took a slow breath, her eyes locked on Richard's. "The Oversight Committee requires a full review," she said, her tone steady, citing protocol as if it were armor. "It's my job to ensure compliance." Richard leaned back in his chair, his smirk widening, a predator toying with prey. "Your job," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Maybe stick to photo ops, sweetheart. Leave the real work to us." The room seemed to shrink, the air thick with hostility, the other agent's grins widening. Karoline's chest tightened, not with fear but with a quiet, burning anger. She thought of her father, Michael Leavitt, who'd walked these halls with pride, only to die under a cloud of unanswered questions. She was here for him, not for their approval. Her fingers brushed the notebook in her pocket, its presence grounding her. She could almost hear her father's voice. "Don't fight with words. Caro, fight with truth." She straightened, ready to press on, but Richard waved a hand, dismissing her. "You're wasting our time," he said, standing as if to end the meeting. The other agents followed suit, their chairs scraping against the floor. Karoline's heart pounded, her mind racing. She couldn't let it end like this, not when she was so close to something, though she didn't yet know what. Her eyes darted to the door, where Tom, the junior agent she'd seen earlier, lingered. His brow was furrowed, his hands fidgeting, as if he were caught between staying silent and speaking up. He'd heard everything, seen everything. Did he sense it too, the undercurrent of something wrong? Karoline opened her mouth to respond, to push back, when a phone rang in the hallway, its shrill tone cutting through the tension. Tom froze, his eyes widening as he reached for his pocket. The other agents glanced at him, their expressions shifting annoyance, maybe suspicion. Richard's smirk faltered for a split second, his gaze flicking to the door. "Take it outside," he snapped at Tom, who nodded quickly and stepped into the hall. Karoline watched him go, her instincts screaming. That call wasn't random, that it was connected to the man she'd seen, to the notebook, to the secrets her father had died for. She stood, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. "We're not done here," she said, addressing Richard directly. "I'll be back tomorrow." Richard's eyes narrowed, his confidence unshaken but his patience thinning. "Suit yourself," he said, his tone a warning. "But don't expect a warm welcome." The other agents filed out, their laughter echoing in the hall, leaving Karoline alone in the cold room. She clutched the notebook, its weight a reminder of why she couldn't back down. The man she'd seen, Daniel, her father's partner, supposedly dead, was here, alive, and hiding something. The phone call, Tom's reaction, Richard's arrogance, it all pointed to a truth buried just out of reach. She stepped into the hallway, her heels echoing in the silence. Whatever was happening, she was closer to it now, and she wouldn't stop until she knew why. The hallway outside the audit room in the Secret Service headquarters in Alexandria, Virginia, stretched long and dim, its fluorescent lights casting stark shadows on the linoleum floor. Karoline Leavitt stood frozen for a moment, her breath shallow, her mind a whirlwind of questions. The air smelled faintly of coffee and ink, a sterile reminder of the building's unyielding order. Her encounter with Richard and his dismissive agents had left her shaken, but it was the figure she'd just seen moving swiftly down the corridor that sent her heart racing. It was Daniel, her father's old partner, a man she'd mourned 5 years ago after a classified mission supposedly claimed his life. Yet there he was, alive, his tall frame and deliberate gait unmistakable. Her fingers tightened around the leather notebook in her pocket, her father's last gift. Its pages filled with cryptic clues she'd never fully unraveled. She was here for an audit, yes, but now she knew this was about something far bigger. Karoline took a step forward, her heels clicking softly, her eyes locked on the spot where Daniel had disappeared into a restricted wing marked by a heavy steel door. Her pulse thrummed, a mix of disbelief and certainty. If Daniel was alive, then the story of her father's death, Michael Leavitt, a decorated agent killed in the same mission, was a lie. She'd spent years piecing together fragments of his final days, haunted by the official report's vagueness, lost in the line of duty. The notebook was her only lead, its shorthand hinting at something called Blackthorn, a word that had surfaced in her father's notes but never in any briefing she'd read. She needed to follow Daniel, to confront him. But the hallway wasn't empty. Richard emerged from the audit room, his broad shoulders filling the doorway, his eyes narrowing as he caught her staring down the corridor. "You're not cleared for that area. Leave it," he snapped, his voice low but laced with suspicion. He stepped closer, his presence looming, his earlier smirk replaced by a harder edge. "What's your real agenda here?" Karoline's stomach twisted, but she met his gaze, her face a mask of calm. "Just doing my job," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. She pulled the notebook from her pocket, flipping it open as if to check her notes. A deliberate move to steady herself. But as her eyes scanned the page, they caught a scribbled line in her father's handwriting coordinates. Precise and unmistakable. Matching the exact location of this building, Her breath hitched. This wasn't a coincidence. Richard scoffed, unconvinced, his arms crossing as he leaned against the wall. "You're no one special," he said, his words dripping with disdain. "You think you can waltz in here and play detective? This isn't Congress. This is the real world." The insult stung, but Karoline barely heard it. Her mind was on the coordinates, on Daniel, on the truth her father had died for. She closed the notebook, her fingers lingering on its worn cover, and looked past Richard. At the far end of the hallway, Tom, the junior agent, stood watching. His expression different now, not pity but curiosity, maybe even concern. He'd been there during the audit, silent but observant, and now he stepped closer, his hands in his pockets, his eyes flicking between Karoline and Richard. "Everything okay here?" Tom asked, his voice cautious but steady. Richard shot him a glare, his patience thinning. "Mind your business, rookie," he said. But Tom didn't back down. Karoline seized the moment, her voice cutting through the tension. "I need access to the mission archives," she said, addressing Richard directly. As part of the audit, it was a bold move, one she hadn't planned, but the coordinates in the notebook gave her a spark of certainty. Richard laughed, a harsh sound that echoed in the hallway. "You expect me to believe you're just here for paperwork," he said, stepping closer, his tone a warning. "You're out of your league, Congresswoman." Karoline held her ground, her heart pounding but her resolve unshaken. She thought of her father, of the way he'd always stood tall, even when the odds were against him. She wasn't here to win Richard's respect. She was here to uncover what he and others were hiding. Tom shifted, his presence a quiet anchor in the storm. "She's got clearance," he said, his voice low but firm, a small act of defiance that made Richard's jaw tighten. The older agent turned away, muttering something about wasting time, but Karoline barely noticed. Her eyes drifted back to the restricted wing, to the door Daniel had slipped through. The coordinates, the notebook, Daniel's survival, it was all connected, and it was bigger than she'd ever imagined. She took a step toward the door, her mind racing. She didn't have access, not yet. But she had something better, her father's legacy, encoded in the pages she carried. Tom watched her, his silence speaking volumes. Richard's footsteps faded down the hall, but his warning lingered. Karoline knew she was crossing a line, one that could cost her more than her reputation. But she also knew she couldn't turn back. The truth was waiting, just beyond that door, and she was closer to it than ever. All she needed was one chance to prove it. The restricted wing of the Secret Service headquarters in Alexandria, Virginia, was a maze of narrow corridors, each one colder and more sterile than the last. Karoline Leavitt moved swiftly, her heels muffled against the linoleum, her breath uneven but determined. The confrontation with Richard in the hallway had left her rattled. His words, "You're no one special," echoing like a challenge she was ready to meet. Her hand rested on the leather notebook in her pocket. Her father's final gift, its pages now a lifeline to a truth she could feel closing in. The coordinates she'd found scrawled in his cryptic shorthand had led her here, to a place she wasn't supposed to be. Daniel's presence, her father's partner, alive against all odds, had turned her routine audit into something far more dangerous. She wasn't just a congresswoman anymore. She was a daughter. And she was done being dismissed. Karoline stopped at a heavy steel door marked "Server Room Authorized Personnel Only." Her heart pounded, a mix of fear and resolve. She'd demanded access to the restricted wing, a bold move that had caught Richard off guard. He'd laughed, his broad frame blocking her path, his voice dripping with scorn. "You think you can just walk in here," he'd said, his eyes glinting with the confidence of someone used to being obeyed. But Tom, the junior agent who'd been watching silently, had stepped forward, his voice quiet but firm. "She's within her rights," he'd said, citing oversight protocol, his words earning a glare from Richard that could have burned through steel. Karoline had seized the opening, slipping past before Richard could argue. Now, standing before the server room, she felt the weight of Tom's small act of courage, a crack in the wall of hostility she'd faced all day. She pulled the notebook from her pocket, her fingers trembling as she flipped to the page with the coordinates. There, in her father's precise handwriting, was a 6-digit key code, tucked beneath the word Blackthorn. She didn't know what it meant, but she trusted it. Her father, Michael Leavitt, had never been careless. She typed the code into the keypad, each beep louder than the last in the silent corridor. Her breath caught as the lock clicked, the door easing open with a soft hiss. Inside, the room was dark, lit only by the faint glow of server racks humming with data. Karoline stepped in, her eyes scanning the shelves until they landed on a box labeled Operation Blackthorn Classified. Her stomach twisted. This was it, the mission that had supposedly killed her father and Daniel. But Daniel was alive, and now she had proof something was wrong. She reached for the box, her hands steady despite the storm in her chest. The files inside were thin, their edges yellowed, but the weight of their secrets was heavy. She opened one, her eyes catching phrases like unauthorized extraction and scapegoat protocol. Her father's name appeared, circled in red, next to a date 5 years ago, the day he'd died. Her throat tightened, grief and anger rising like a tide. This wasn't an accident. It was a cover-up, and her father had paid the price. She was so lost in the pages that she didn't hear the door slam open behind her. Richard stormed in, his face red with fury. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he shouted, his voice shaking the small room. "You're in way over your head." "Leave it." Karoline turned, clutching the file, her voice calm but unyielding. "I'm doing what you should have done, finding the truth." Richard lunged forward, reaching for the file, but a new voice cut through the chaos. "That's enough. Agent—" It was Director Hayes, a tall man with gray hair and a presence that silenced the room. He stood in the doorway, his eyes sharp, his suit impeccable. Tom stood behind him, his face pale but resolute. He'd called Hayes, Karoline realized, a discreet move that had shifted the balance. Richard froze, his hand hovering in the air, his confidence crumbling. Hayes stepped forward, his gaze flicking to the file in Karoline's hands. "Explain this," he said, his tone leaving no room for evasion. Karoline held up the notebook, her voice steady despite the tears pricking her eyes. "This belonged to Agent Leavitt, my father." The room fell silent, the words landing like a stone in still water. Richard's face paled, his mouth opening but no words coming out. The other agents who'd followed Hayes inside exchanged glances, murmurs rippling through them. Karoline opened the file, pointing to her father's name. He was blamed for a mission that went wrong. But it wasn't his fault. It was covered up. Hayes's eyes narrowed, his expression unreadable, but he didn't interrupt. Tom shifted, his nod almost imperceptible, a silent acknowledgement of her courage. Outside, the faint sound of tires on gravel broke the tension. Karoline glanced through the small window, spotting a news van pulling into the parking lot, its antenna gleaming under the streetlights. Someone had tipped off the press, Tom. Maybe. Or another agent who'd overheard the commotion. The story was slipping beyond these walls, and Karoline felt a surge of hope. She wasn't just a congresswoman, and she wasn't just a daughter. She was the one who'd opened the door to a truth no one could ignore. Richard's hands clenched, his eyes darting to Hayes, but the director's focus was on Karoline. "Keep talking," Hayes said, his voice low but commanding. She nodded, her grip on the notebook tightening. The truth was taking shape, and it was only the beginning. The server room in the Secret Service headquarters in Alexandria, Virginia, was a cocoon of humming machines and cold air, its dim glow casting long shadows across the faces of those inside. Karoline Leavitt stood at the center, her father's notebook clutched in one hand, the Operation Blackthorn file in the other. The weight of her discovery pressed against her chest, a mix of triumph and sorrow that made her hands tremble. Director Hayes, a towering figure with gray hair and a gaze that could cut through steel, stood before her, his eyes scanning the documents she'd handed over. Richard, the lead agent who'd mocked her from the start, was backed against a server rack, his face flushed, his words stumbling as he tried to regain control. "This is a misunderstanding," he stammered, his voice thin. "She's blowing this out of proportion." But the room wasn't listening to him anymore. The truth was taking root, and it was louder than his excuses. Karoline's heart ached as she watched Hayes flip through the file, his brow furrowing at phrases like scapegoat protocol and staged casualty. Operation Blackthorn, she'd learned, was a botched mission 5 years ago, one that had gone wrong in ways the public was never meant to know. Her father, Michael Leavitt, had been blamed, his death reported as a tragic accident to silence questions. But the files told a different story. Powerful figures had been protected, and her father had been sacrificed to keep their secrets. Karoline's throat tightened, grief rising like a wave, but she held it back. She wasn't here to break. She was here to make things right. Her eyes flicked to the doorway, where Daniel stood, no longer hiding. Her father's partner, presumed dead, had stepped into the light, his face lined with guilt and resolve. "She's telling the truth," Daniel said, his voice heavy, each word carrying the weight of years in hiding. "Michael was set up. I ran because I knew they'd come for me next." The room stilled. The other agents, some who'd laughed at Karoline earlier, shifting uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Daniel and the files. Richard's face twisted, his desperation palpable. "You're believing this?" He snapped at Hayes, pointing at Karoline. "She's just a kid with a grudge." But his voice cracked, and no one answered. Karoline met Daniel's gaze, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. They'd both lost Michael, but they were here now, fighting for him. Her chest ached, not just for her father, but for the years she'd spent believing he was gone by chance, not by design. Tom, the junior agent who'd quietly supported her, stepped forward, his hands trembling as he held out a USB drive. "These are the logs," he said, his voice low but steady. "I pulled them last night. They back up everything she's saying." Hayes took the drive, his expression unreadable, but the gesture shifted the room's energy. The agents who'd been silent began to whisper, some nodding, others staring at Richard with new suspicion. Tom's act was small but seismic, a crack in the loyalty Richard had taken for granted. Karoline felt a surge of gratitude, her eyes meeting Tom's for a moment. He'd been a bystander, a shadow in the background, but now he was part of this, part of the truth breaking free. Hayes plugged the drive into a laptop, his fingers swift as he opened the files. The screen lit up with timestamps, coded messages, and names, some redacted, others painfully familiar. Michael Leavitt's name appeared again and again, tied to orders he'd never given, failures he'd never caused. Karoline's breath caught, her fingers tightening on the notebook. This was her father's vindication, but it came at a cost. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, as the reality settled in. Her father had been betrayed by the very people he'd served. Richard's authority crumbled with every click of Hayes's mouse, his protests growing weaker. "This is nonsense," he muttered, but his eyes betrayed him, darting to the door as if he could escape what was coming. Hayes turned to Karoline, his voice calm but commanding. "You've opened a door, Congresswoman. Are you ready for what's on the other side?" It was a question, but also a warning. Karoline nodded, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "I've been ready for 5 years," she said. The words felt like a release, a promise to her father, to herself. She'd come here for an audit, but she'd found something bigger, a chance to right a wrong that had haunted her family. Outside, the sound of voices grew louder, punctuated by the flash of cameras. Reporters were gathering, their vans clogging the parking lot. Someone, Tom, perhaps, or another agent moved by the truth, had tipped them off. The story was spreading, faster than anyone could contain. Karoline's eyes drifted to Daniel, his face etched with the same loss she carried. They were bound by this moment, by the man they'd both loved. The weight of her father's absence pressed against her, but so did a new lightness, a sense that she was finally setting him free. Richard slumped against the server rack, his defiance gone, his hands shaking. Hayes issued a quiet order. "Start the investigation, now." The agents moved, some with purpose, others with reluctance, as the room buzzed with the energy of a reckoning. Karoline stood still, the notebook warm in her hand, her heart aching for the father she'd never see again. The truth was out, but it wasn't over. Not yet. What would it cost to see this through the server room in the Secret Service headquarters in Alexandria? Virginia was no longer a cold, sterile cage. It buzzed with a chaotic energy, voices overlapping, footsteps echoing as agents moved with purpose or stood frozen, processing the unraveling truth. Karoline Leavitt stood at the heart of it, her father's leather notebook clasped tightly in her hands, its worn edges grounding her amid the storm. The air smelled of dust and overheated electronics. But to Karoline, it felt alive, as if the room itself were breathing with the weight of what she'd uncovered. Operation Blackthorn, the mission that had stolen her father, Michael Leavitt, was no longer a secret buried in classified files. It was exposed, its lies laid bare, and the man who'd dismissed her, Richard, was crumbling under the gaze of Director Hayes and the agents who'd once followed him without question. Karoline's chest ached, a deep, familiar grief stirred by the files she'd read, the words that confirmed her father had been betrayed. But there was something else too, a quiet strength, a sense that she was finally giving him the justice he'd been denied. She stood still, her dark eyes steady, even as the room swirled around her. Director Hayes, his gray hair catching the dim light, stepped closer, his presence calming the chaos. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch firm but gentle, like a father might offer. "Your father was a good man," he said, his voice soft, carrying a weight that made Karoline's throat tighten. "We'll make this right." The words were simple, but they landed like a promise, one she'd waited 5 years to hear. Before she could respond, Daniel approached, his face etched with lines of guilt and loss. He'd been her father's partner, the man she'd thought was dead, the one who'd hidden to survive the same conspiracy that took Michael. In his hand was a small, creased photograph, its edges softened by time. He held it out, his eyes avoiding hers. Karoline took it, her fingers trembling as she looked down. It was her father, younger, his smile wide and unguarded, holding a 6-year-old Karoline on his shoulders at a park. She was laughing, her hair a mess, her tiny hands gripping his. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and sudden, but she didn't let them fall. She couldn't break. Not now. Not when she was so close to honoring him. Richard stood in the corner, his badge stripped, his shoulders slumped. The arrogance that had defined him was gone, replaced by a hollow muttering of apologies. "I didn't know," he said, his voice barely audible, directed at no one in particular. "I was just following orders." The agents around him watched in silence, some with newfound respect for Karoline, others with shame for their earlier laughter. She didn't look at Richard. His apologies meant nothing compared to the truth she'd fought for. She turned to the room, her voice quiet but piercing, cutting through the murmurs. "This isn't about me," she said. "Oh, it's about the truth. My father deserved better. So do we all." The words settled over the room, and for a moment, the chaos paused. The air felt warmer, the light softer, as if her father's presence lingered, nodding in approval. Tom, the junior agent who'd risked his career to back her, stood near the door, his face pale but his eyes steady. He offered a small nod, a gesture of solidarity that spoke louder than words. Karoline returned it, a silent thank you for his courage, for choosing truth over loyalty to a flawed system. The other agents shifted, some whispering, others staring at the files still open on the laptop, their screens glowing with evidence of betrayal. Richard's fall was complete, but it wasn't his defeat that mattered. It was the truth, standing tall, undeniable. Hayes spoke again, his voice steady. "This goes higher than we thought," he said, his eyes on Karoline. "You've started something, Congresswoman. It won't end here." She nodded, her grip on the notebook tightening. She'd known this was bigger than one mission, one man. But hearing it from Hayes made it real. The truth about Blackthorn wasn't just her father's story. It was a crack in a system that had protected the wrong people for too long. Outside, the clamor of reporters grew louder, their voices carrying through the walls, their cameras flashing like lightning. The news vans had multiplied, their antennas piercing the night sky. Someone had leaked the story, and it was spreading, a wildfire no one could contain. Karoline stepped toward the door, her heart heavy but her resolve unbroken. Daniel followed, his steps slow, as if carrying the weight of years in hiding. "He'd be proud of you," he said, his voice breaking. Karoline didn't reply, but her eyes glistened, the photograph still in her hand. She walked into the hallway, the cool air hitting her face, the noise of the reporters growing clearer. They swarmed the entrance, shouting questions, their microphones thrusting forward, but Karoline walked past, her head high, her steps steady. She didn't need to speak. The truth was already echoing across the nation, carried by those who'd seen it unfold. And that was when she felt it at peace, fragile but real, settling over her like a quiet dawn. But what would come when the sun rose? Karoline Leavitt drove away from the Secret Service headquarters in Alexandria, Virginia, the city's lights blurring into streaks of gold and white in her rearview mirror. The night was cool, the air slipping through the cracked window of her sedan, carrying the faint scent of damp grass and asphalt. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, steady but tired, the weight of the day settling into her bones. In the passenger seat, her father's leather notebook lay open, its pages fluttering slightly in the breeze. The photograph Daniel had given her, her father smiling, holding a younger Karoline, was tucked inside. A quiet reminder of why she'd fought. The chaos of the headquarters, the reporters' shouts, Richard's fall, and Hayes's promise all felt distant now, like a storm that had passed but left the ground forever changed. Karoline's heart was heavy, but there was a lightness too, a peace she hadn't known in years. The radio hummed softly, a news anchor's voice breaking through the static. Congress has announced a public inquiry into Operation Blackthorn, a classified mission exposed today by Congresswoman Karoline Leavitt. The words felt surreal, as if they belonged to someone else's life. Caroline turned the volume down, not because she didn't care, but because she needed silence to process what she'd done. She'd walked into that building as a young congresswoman on a routine audit, dismissed as an outsider, a novice. She'd left as the woman who'd uncovered a betrayal that had cost her father his life. Michael Leavitt, the man who'd taught her to listen, to wait, to trust in truth, was finally being seen for the hero he was. The thought brought a lump to her throat, but also a quiet pride that warmed her chest. She pulled into a small park on the outskirts of Alexandria, its gravel lot empty under the glow of a single street lamp. The park was nothing special, just a few benches, a swing set creaking in the wind, and a cluster of oak trees standing like sentinels. Caroline parked and stepped out, the notebook in her hands. The photograph slipped into her pocket. She sat on a bench, the wood cold against her legs, and opened the notebook to a page she'd read 100 times. Her father's handwriting was precise. Each letter a piece of him dates. Codes, the word Blackthorn underlined twice. She traced the ink with her finger, feeling closer to him than she had since he'd died. The pain of his loss lingered, sharp and familiar, but it was softer now, woven with the pride of having honored him. Back at the headquarters, the fallout was unfolding. Richard faced suspension, his career unraveling as quickly as his arrogance had crumbled. Daniel, her father's partner, had agreed to testify, his voice breaking as he spoke of Michael's courage, of the mission that had torn their lives apart. Karoline hadn't stayed to watch it all play out. She didn't need to. The truth was free, carried by the reporters who'd swarmed the building, their stories spreading across the country. Congress was moving fast, promising reforms, demanding answers. But for Karoline, it wasn't about the headlines or the inquiries. It was about the man who'd raised her, who'd believed in her, who'd left her a notebook that held the key to justice. She thought of Tom, the junior agent who'd risked everything to stand by her. She'd learned later that he'd been the one to tip off the press, a quiet act of defiance that had turned the tide. Back at the headquarters, she pictured him now, pinning a new policy memo to the bulletin board transparency reforms, inspired by her fight, by her father's sacrifice. The image brought a soft smile to her lips, the kind that felt like a release. Tom had been a stranger that morning, a bystander who'd chosen to act. So had Daniel, stepping out of the shadows. So had Hayes, listening when it mattered. They were proof that truth didn't stand alone, it grew stronger when others carried it too. Caroline leaned back, the stars faint above the park, the night wrapping around her like a blanket. She wasn't just a congresswoman, and she wasn't just a daughter. She was proof that truth could stand tall, even when it started in silence, even when it came from someone others had dismissed. The weight of her journey, Margaret's condescension, Richard's mockery. The years of unanswered questions settled into something like peace, fragile but real. She closed the notebook, her fingers lingering on its cover, and slipped the photograph into her hand. Her father's smile looked back at her, and for the first time in years, she felt whole. The wind picked up, rustling the trees, and Caroline stood, her steps light as she walked back to her car. The news would keep churning, the inquiry would dig deeper, and the system might even change, if only a little. But for now, she'd done enough. She'd carried her father's truth, and it had echoed across the nation, not with a shout, but with the quiet power of someone brave enough to walk through fire. as she drove away, the park fading behind her. She knew this wasn't the end. Truth didn't whisper. It was loud when someone dared to say it, and she'd said it. What would the world do with it now? Karoline's hand lingered on the notebook, her father's handwriting a silent pulse under her fingertips. The park was still, the stars faint, but her heart felt full, heavy with a peace that carried both loss and pride. Justice hadn't roared, it had whispered, steady and sure. Did it need more than that? Sometimes, the loudest truths are the ones spoken softly, carried by those brave enough to walk through fire for what's right.